to create jobs for our youth. Unemployment in Nigeria is about 24%, in South Africa 24%, etc. In fact, for many countries in the continent, you know, and our numbers, we have to look at these statistics because sometimes they're not as strong as they could be. But for many countries, unemployment is above 20%. But youth unemployment is even higher, at above 40% in many countries. And for the future, you can imagine that by 2035, the size of Africa's labor force will be greater than that of any nation, and yes, even larger than that of China. This is a challenge for this generation. So we have to worry about where the jobs will come from. And they have to come from the private sector. Today I was speaking to some members of the private sector here in Ghana, and I know in my own country, and they still feel that government is a bit too heavy, too much in the way, not creating enough room. Well, if we want the private sector to be the leader, we have to think of how do we remove the binding constraints on the private sector's operation. And I think the first and foremost one, of course, is the lack of infrastructure everywhere across the continent. I think the numbers on infrastructure are well known to all of us. Just take power, for example. The entire sub-Saharan Africa region, with a total population of nearly 800 million, generates only about 2% of the world's electricity output. That is equal to the total output of Spain. Our entire continent generates electricity equal to the total output of Spain. This poor infrastructure reduces the productivity of African firms by about 40%. Especially for small businesses such as barber shops, local restaurants, etc. Overall, Africa's infrastructure deficit reduces the region's economic growth by about 2 percentage points each year, according to the World Bank. So simply, we just need to target a lot of investments into this fiscal sector. When I went to talk to the Chinese, the Central Bank Governor of China, to ask him, so just stick with me and tell me what it is we need to do in my country to get it right. He said to me, what you need is infrastructure, 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 and discipline. Nigeria is undisciplined, he said. I said, thank you. For Africa, an estimated $120 billion per annum is needed for infrastructure investments. And even after accounting for available resources, a funding gap of $50 billion still remains, with the largest gap being in the power sector, as I just said. The World Bank estimates that about 2/3 of the expenditure would be for new infrastructure assets, and 1/3 of the funding needed to maintain existing infrastructure. Another area where we're very poor. We tend to build, but we do not maintain, and then we have to build again. The numbers are sizable and represent about 10 to 12% of GDP for some African countries. But let us not think it's too daunting. We have to remember that China has been investing nearly 14% of its GDP consistently in infrastructure. And that's why the Central Bank Governor told me it's infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. So we have to get it right. To address the jobs problem, we also need to invest in developing the skills of our citizens, particularly our youth. Africa has a pending demographic bulge. The median age in our region is about 20 years, compared with 29 years in Asia, and listen to this, 40 years in Europe. So we're a young population, and Europe is an older population, and Japan, of course. But we can only realize this demographic dividend if we invest in the training of our labor force in practical, technical, and vocational skills. For example, professional craftsmen, particularly in my country, such as welders, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, mechanics, and so on. You know, in Nigeria, people believe that the only way to go is for university education. And so we have our plumbers, technicians, and others by default. And so what do we get? You know, when we need to build a house or a building, we usually come to Ghana, Togo, and Benin, looking for craftsmen. And I often joke, much as I love my fellow citizens, you know, we are building a house, you know, and the steps are not quite straight, and the wall is bent a little bit. And then you say to the builder, this actually happened to my husband and I. You know, we need to straighten this thing. These steps look a bit crooked. And, you know, the builder said to me, Madam, manage now. Manage it. It's good enough. You're too demanding. So I often say at home, why do we have this management mentality? Manage. No, what we need to do if we want to claim the 21st century in Africa is that we cannot manage it. We have to have the best. The best talent, the best skills, the best trained people. We have to become more entrepreneurial. Even in my country where every but be excellent in what they are doing. That is the way we are going to claim the 21st century. The second challenge I want to examine is widening inequality. Despite Africa's recent strong growth and rising middle class, many poor households are being left behind, and the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. As the Arab Spring has taught us, rising inequality and youth discontent could have serious political consequences. Increasing inequality is becoming a challenge across many fast-growing emerging economies. China, Indonesia, Brazil, many of them are struggling with this. Economists use the Gini coefficient to assess the extent of inequality. This is an index that measures the concentration of household incomes, and a higher index implies higher inequality. To give you some numbers for reference, China, with its rapid growth and rising inequality, has a Gini index of 42. For Africa, 24 countries have Gini indices higher than China. For Ghana, I believe the Gini is about 43. For Nigeria, it's slightly higher, 49. For Botswana and South Africa, the index is over 60. So all across the continent, we have to look at this issue of inequality and the converse, which is inclusive growth. As you can see in Ghana, at least your growth is more inclusive than ours in Nigeria. And we're really looking at this critically to see what we can do to drill down. And I believe the answer is jobs, jobs, jobs. We need to take deliberate actions to address this issue by introducing social protection measures which target poor households and